Good morning, dolls, and welcome to Little Gretchen's workshop. So today we're making a mop. Now this is a household item that's way overdue, but I did realize that because I'm working on the second phase of the renovation of the rooming house dollhouse, which actually includes the bathroom, there's no way I could fix up the bathroom and not have a mop to clean it up. We're also going to enhance that bucket that I've had. So let's go ahead and get to it. Now, I actually am using the technique that's very similar to my making my broom with burlap. If you dolls haven't seen that video, definitely check it out in my playlist. So I'm pulling the strands from one layer of the burlap to give me the strands for the mop head, or yeah, the mop head portion of my mop. And be very careful, dolls. I'm using my pointed tool to pull the strands. You could use a toothpick, anything pointed, just to get in between those layers of the burlap. And you can make your mop as long or as short as you want it to be. I actually wanted mine to look a little extreme, like extra long, if you know what I mean. But you'll see what I'm referring to in a moment, dolls. So I kept looking at it and checking it to determine if the strands were long enough to do what I was intending to do with it. And when I got them to the desired length, I began to determine how tight I wanted to wrap them around the handle of the mop. Now I did leave a portion of it unwrapped because that's the portion I'm going to put my glue on. Now you see all those strands I pulled? I actually decided to use those to actually make my mop head thicker or fuller. Now, I actually used my previously made broom handle as a guide as far as the length of the handle of the mop. I already knew that that worked well with the size of my dolls, so I definitely used that as a guide. For the purposes of this video, 4¼ inches will work for your handle. So after I worked on the handle a little bit and sanded the tip of it to make sure it wasn't pointed because I don't want the dolls hurting their hands while they're mopping. So after I was satisfied with the top of the handle, I started to prepare the body of my mop. So I left the part that I left unraveled, I put some of the fabric fusion there, and I began to stick those strands that I had pulled out of the mop portion onto the glue because I wanted my mop to be nice and full. It's nothing worse than trying to mop with a mop head that's sparse or thin. So I wanted to make it fuller. And so I just laid those extra strands on top of the unraveled portion. Now, dolls, I sped this part up because I didn't want it to be too tedious and redundant, but just gently lay it into your glue until you get the desired fullness. And only you can decide what full enough is. So after you're done adding your strands for fullness, it's time to create the mop. Now I added the fabric fusion to the handle of my mop and began to wrap it. And as you wrap it, you definitely want to squeeze and press the glue into the strands of the burlap because you actually want it to saturate the entire bottom portion where the stem of your handle is. And I allowed that to dry. And after I thought it was dry and stable, I began to wrap it with some brass wire I had. Now I'm using brass wire. You can use whatever type of wire you have. I used the brass wire and wrapped it tight, and I wrapped it a lot. You can use any kind of wire you have, but you definitely want it to be very, very thin so that it won't give a bulky effect at the top of your mop. Now, when I was done wrapping my wire around the base of my handle, I did add some Gorilla Gel super glue to lock the wire down. And also, I just pressed it in a little bit with my wire tool to make sure it stayed stuck. Now, the burlap strands are very, very stiff. They're very, very rigid. That's one reason I use them to make my brooms. But in making my mop, I knew they were going to have the look I wanted, but unless I did something to manipulate the strands, it wouldn't have the shape that I wanted. So I used my trusted water and glue solution. So I took my burlap strands and dipped it into some of the water and glue solution. Now, dolls, you know it's going to get hard, but even though it's going to get hard, it's going to harden into the shape that I want. So I'll actually be able to place it and stage it around the rooming dollhouse the way I want, but it'll have the right shape. So after saturating the fibers of the burlap, I began to bend it and shape it into kind of a curled look. I wanted to look like it was saturated with water and it had been sloshed around and almost like it had made a mess. But I wanted those strands to kind of dry in that shape while the broom handle was kind of propped up against something. You'll see what I mean shortly. So I just kept actually just adding more and more glue. And there, the part that I added to the tips of the mop had a lot of glue residue on it. So I really wanted that part to be saturated. So I partially filled the bucket with hot glue because my craft glaze really is not something that would get solid like that. So I thought that using the hot glue would be great as a filler. And then I'll add the shine to the top with my craft glaze. Now the craft glaze is what I used on the tips of my paint brushes and inside my paint can to give them the still wet or shiny effect. If you haven't seen my video about my faux paint cans, definitely check that video out in my playlist. And after a portion of the hot glue cooled, I began to fill it some more. Now, although hot glue is pretty much self-leveling, I did do it in more than one layer because I wanted it to look as clear as possible. It was going to look cloudy, but I just did it in layers because I didn't want it to bubble too much. So after I finished my layers, I did allow it to cool. It did have a little bubbling, but it didn't bother me because I actually wanted it to look like dirty soap water. So after I was done, I allowed it to cool. Be careful with your fingers because the metal gets hot. So I added one layer of the craft glaze and I added it to the old rag as well because I wanted it to look wet. And after I added the first layer, I did a second layer. So it looks a little white. It doesn't look clear like it will look, but you have to allow it to dry. And definitely do this after the glue has cooled because I'm not sure how it would react if the hot glue is hot. Now I did want to do something else with this particular look, but I wanted to use my resin. So I still had another little blue rag and I squeezed some of my UV resin onto some wax paper and then just tucked the little blue rag into it. I didn't touch it, dolls. I just tucked it in and I used my pointed tool to kind of smush it around and added a little bit more UV resin to the top to make sure it was saturated. After I smushed it down as much as I wanted, I pushed it under my UV light and allowed it to cure. Now, little projects like this, always make sure you cure them on both sides to make sure it's not wet because sometimes things like the rag could keep it from curing. Now, I had also had one that I had made previously. I just decided I wanted two. I thought it would really look cute with the mop and make it look like a really, really messy scene in the dollhouse. Now, after it's cured, I gently peeled it away from the the wax paper, and it came off pretty easily. So my second thing was that I wanted to make the bucket look messy. So I put some resin on the wax paper and tucked the bucket into the resin, and I cured it as well. Now I can't wait to try it inside the rooming house dollhouse. So here we are inside the kitchen, and it looks like somebody has made an absolute mess. They have two puddles and a drippy bucket and a wet mop in the kitchen. They better clean this up before my assistant sees it because she's not going to be happy. Now, dolls, if you've enjoyed this video today, definitely let me know in the comments. Also, like, share, and subscribe. And always look for me on Mondays and Wednesdays after 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And also, I want to say a special thank you to all my subscribers and to those of you all who haven't subscribed, but you're watching. I appreciate you as well. Looking forward to seeing you, dolls, on the next episode of Little Gretchen's Workshop. Bye-bye now, dolls.